Alrighty, well let's do this. And what an exciting PeaceCon! This is it's been a fantastic day. Tomorrow, looking forward to it again, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity of moderating this panel. So my name is Michael Collins. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Economics and Peace. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. Thanks for placing your trust in me as a moderator. I hope that we're going to make the session as enjoyable as we can for educators, but also for for peace builders and for interested parties alike. The title of the panel specifically is Yes, You Can Teach Peace, equipping educators to inspire youth-led local peace building. I'm joined by three very esteemed panelists: Kate English, who's the executive director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights; Patricia Schaefer, executive director of New Gen Peace Builders; Kerry Huberty, a social emotional learning specialist from Charlotte Mecklenburg School in North Carolina. Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to all of you. We're joined by each of you, and we'd love to kind of get a better feel for the group, and to also play around with the platform that we're on a bit. So we'd like to sort of create a quick poll, and we'd love to ask you to kind of spend a couple of, well, just a second completing it, in terms of who do we have in the room? Are we educators? Are we peace builders? Are we purely interested parties? Did we perhaps hit the wrong button and end up in the wrong session? We'd love to be able to hear more about that from you, to get a better feel for exactly where we are and the audience that we have with us today. We hope that there's going to be plenty of opportunities to be able to interact. You'll see on the room chat that you have the options there, and you can just go ahead and press that button that you see on your screens. So as we do that, there's a couple of peace-related concepts that I'd like to kind of bring up. They're going to be, potentially rearing their head at various points. Now, a number of you may be very familiar with these already. Some others may not. And that's the concept of negative peace and positive peace. Now, negative peace is something that we can describe as the absence of violence or fear of violence. So, countries with low levels of homicide or low levels of violent crime, for example, along with other measures, can be considered, countries that have high levels of negative peace. This is quite a tidy definition of peace, because it's something measurable, it's something concrete, right? And it gets rid of a lot of the fuzziness or marshmallowness that's very wrongly attributed to peace, and also to peace education, for that matter. It allows us to identify where peace building and peace education is most needed. But it also allows us to be able to identify which are the countries that are most peaceful, or which are the countries that are improving most in peacefulness over time. Now, why is that important? Because measuring that enables us to be able to more effectively understand the attitudes and the institutions and structures that create and sustain peace over time. So that's what we refer to when we talk about positive peace, right? Which is essentially what is, under the hood, so to speak. So kind of using a health analogy, measuring negative peace is the equivalent of measuring your BMI or your cholesterol or your blood pressure. It allows you to see, where you're going, what direction you're going in, right? Positive peace is a measure of how much you're sleeping, or the amount of vegetables you're eating, or how much exercise you're getting. It's a measure of, what you're doing. Now, both forms of peace can be measured, and both of them can be acted upon. And the reason I emphasize this or bring these up is because positive peace can be especially useful because it expands the definition of peace and peace education, right? So peace education is less about stopping wars, and it becomes a lot more about helping societies to flourish. So this, in turn, broadens the way that educators can engage with students, and the amount of peace building activities that students can subsequently do. So I'm kind of waffling on a bit, I suppose you could say, and I think by far this would be much better represented by our panelists that we have here today. So Kate, I'm going to kick it off with you. You've spent over 20 years in education. You're a fellow for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. You've got peace education experience in the Ukraine. Thank you very much for those poll results. We'll put those in our pocket. And thank you for sharing. It's glad to see that nobody was in the wrong room. So welcome again, everyone. Kate, just to mention that you've got significant peace education experience internationally in the Ukraine, Bosnia, Rwanda, Cambodia, if I remember correctly, and others as well. So as a broad sort of kickoff question, I'd love to ask you, what do you sort of see as the role of peace education? How do you in particular apply it? And sort of what are the some of the key elements that we can use to sort of expand peace education around the world? Take it away, Kate.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. I would start by saying that for us, the most important thing in our work is to connect teachers to each other for support, to network, to learn from one another what works and what we might want to avoid. We believe that educators working together, they have an exponential impact, which may seem obvious, but sometimes we focus, for us, we know that we're kind of the shore on which the tide of students comes and goes, and that our impact is exponential. So every year we may welcome 20 new students in a primary school classroom, or perhaps if you're teaching middle school or high school and you've got 5 or 6 sections, you may see as many as 150 or even more students in a year. And so the impact of one teacher to really affect peace education and how it permeates throughout a community and a culture and a society is quite substantial. So for us to support one another, learn from one another, and to really be able to work together as teachers, as professionals globally is at the heart of what EIHR does, and is very strongly what we believe in. And Michael, did you have another question, or shall I just continue with the?
Yeah, no, I was giving you free rein, Kate. Take it away. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So having answered that question, let me tell you a little bit more about our work. So the Educators Institute for Human Rights is founded by teachers, myself included, for teachers, and we support communities recovering from violent conflict. We do this by applying lessons from the Holocaust and other egregious violations of human rights, like the Rwandan genocide, as a starting point for teaching secondary school students about how these conflicts evolve and how to prevent them. So as I said, we work teacher to teacher in coordination with country-based partners. So it's very important for us to develop teaching materials that are customized to individual country contexts, that we convene training workshops and summits, that really we do an assessment to partner together on our work, and that we support the formation of educator networks. We follow the lead of local partners in agenda and priority setting, and our peer-to-peer approach is essential. EIHR is committed to a decolonized practice wherein teachers from around the world support one another, as I'd mentioned just a moment ago, and that we collaborate on ideas, that we build content together, and that we develop training that's focused on assets-based thinking. We might want to know what the challenges are, but it's really more helpful to know what the strengths are that we can all share together. We also want to look at teacher trauma, address teacher trauma and isolation that might be tied to the personal experience of atrocities, and that's an important feature of the work that we do. And that can be what we've seen on occasion when we talk about the Holocaust. We'll often see recognition in the eyes of teachers who have a history of genocide or other human rights abuses in their society. And to some extent, we see them comment that they don't feel as lonely. They don't feel alone in that they're not the only society that's experienced that. And that can then lead to opportunities, again, for us to build those networks and to help teachers work together to solve problems. So we've developed an approach to our content that once we've established, and I'm looking for how to advance the slides. There it is. Our strategic content approach we've developed over time really takes into account some key principles and then how we bring that all together. So at the core of what we do, we take into account the recommendations for teaching and learning about the Holocaust as they're established by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And many of the Holocaust organizations worldwide follow that framework, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. And those of us who are trained at the Holocaust Museum here, we look to the guidelines that they've developed that are based on these international guidelines. When we design curriculum, we like to use a method that's most teachers were aware of. It's called understanding by design, or UBD. And it begins by just identifying an essential understanding. What is it that a deep understanding that you want students to come away with at the end of a lesson? And then you plan backwards from that. And the backward design allows teachers to plan lessons, to sequence what they're going to be working on, to think about what resources are going to inform that essential question rather than just making it up as you go. Not that teachers make it up as they go, but if you're moving forward without really knowing what your essential question is, it's much more difficult. So you've had an opportunity to look at all of those elements to create lesson plans and assessment tools that are based on that essential understanding. We also want to incorporate concepts of trauma-informed teaching. We recognize that both students and teachers are impacted by violence. And we're currently working with researchers, including one of our board members, to evaluate and implement best practices for educator and pupil support. Data from the IEP we have found over time offers over a decade of qualitative research. So I'm an English teacher. Much of what I do would be considered quantitative, unless we're talking about grammar. But we like the idea that we can have qualitative information taken from all of the research done by the IEP over a decade. And we can apply what is often regarded as a qualitative research field. We can imbue that with quantitative data. Our projects begin with foundational learning that is factually accurate, reliable, and includes clear terms and definitions in chronological and geographical context, and an understanding responsible photo and document analysis. This can also extend into other areas such as source analysis or digital citizenship, and that's where we lay the foundation. In researching and analyzing the history of atrocity and atrocity prevention, it's critical to balance the understanding of those commonalities that can create positive change, but also recognizing and respecting the uniqueness of experiences in each circumstance. So one of the guidelines, for example, says that we don't make comparisons of pain. We don't want to minimize someone's experience by making what might seem like an inappropriate comparison to something else. On the other hand, if we can understand patterns and make comparisons of predictors of genocide or atrocity on things that work to rebuild in the wake of it and things that work in response, those positive things, that's essential to understand. We want to also appreciate the individual stories and experiences. So this could be happening at the macro level between one atrocity and another in terms of societal level, or we could be looking at it in terms of individuals and their personal experiences. All of our projects also include a recognition of national and state standards. So whether it's an entire country or state by state or province by province, that we understand what their standards or concepts of learning are within the context of a project in order to align any of the materials that we're working on with the teacher's assessment requirements. What are we working on currently? Our current work started in Rwanda in 2011. So we've been around for about 11 years now. Since then, it's expanded to include active programs and projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where earlier today we launched a teaching manual created by diverse teachers for educators in the region, and it's called Holocaust and Peace: Learning from the Past for the Future. In Cambodia, Argentina, and most recently, as you will see, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those are other places where we have current and active programming ongoing. We began early research in Northern Ireland as part of a 7 Foundation project, Imagine Reflections on Peace, which we'll be talking about in just a moment. As a US-based organization, we feel it's critical to examine our own history and the continuing impact of atrocities on our own soil. Part of our decolonizing approach must acknowledge the fallacy of American exceptionalism, and it must include accurate information on the history of ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide perpetrated against enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and other groups that are almost too numerous to mention. When we when we think about these programs, the one that we did most recently in early December really blew us all away, if you will, to paraphrase Hamilton. We thought we were starting a small pilot program. We wanted to, as we usually do, we start small. We talk with teachers. We might run a small program to do that assessment, that assets-based assessment. In the case of DRC, Julesen, who's the director at the Action Program for Sustainable Development, its French acronym is PADS. He's been a friend of the organization for many years, and we invited him to observe and participate in our Kigali workshop in January of 2020. He started planning this workshop that you see in front of you before the first day even ended, and came to me with a budget and a full proposal that by the end of the event, he had it all written up and ready to go. We did decide it would be best to hold a smaller pilot workshop, not to start with a huge program right out of the gate, but to begin at the grassroots and then evaluate what teachers actually want, and then what they'd like to share with other teachers. What do they feel they could bring that other teachers could value? We were thinking that it would draw about 25 or 30 teachers. And about a week before the event, Julesen told us that over 300 people had already applied to participate. And by the time we were about 2 days out, it was over 400. So this is what I mean. We had no idea that we were going to get that kind of a response. More than half of the people who applied weren't even teachers. They were from other professions like law and journalism, where they were running NGOs related to the work. And so when we spoke about it together, Julesen, Amadla Mpayimana, who's our director of education in Rwanda, we all decided on two things very quickly. One was that we would ask any non-teachers to just wait for a bit, and we'll come back and look at programming we could do that's for a broader audience. But in the meantime, we wanted to make sure to find a way to include all of the teachers who'd applied to participate, rather than keeping it in the small number. Let's just invite everybody in. In the end, it was about 157 teachers that participated in this event. And Julesen's team at PADS sent out 6 people with laptops. They volunteered to go out to 6 different villages, some of them quite remote, and some of them in areas that are in the midst of conflict. And if you know anything about the geography in DRC, and if you recognize the names of some of these towns, you'll already know what I'm talking about. Most teachers walked between 10 and 15 kilometers to a central location, like a classroom or a porch or someone's home, in order to gather in front of a single laptop to participate. One of the sites in Beni, so as I was saying a moment before, is where some of the worst violence is taking place right now. And that's the photograph in the upper right corner of the slide. In conversation with the rest of the day's panel today, everyone here today, when we were planning for this, it occurred to us that if we can teach peace from a single laptop in a small DRC village, then we should be able to teach peace anywhere. Another example of EIHR's partnerships in peace education is our collaboration with the Seven Foundation for their project, Imagine Reflections on Peace, which includes a book, an exhibition, and short films conceived to encourage discourse and conversation around peace building and ending conflict. So for those of you in the DC area, or if you're planning to be here in the DC area in the spring, this exhibition, the film, the book, will be at the U.S. Institute for Peace starting June 2nd and running until the end of July. EIHR will work closely with USIP to engage educators in the project with a lot of outreach to the districts in the region and the DMV, including extensive educational materials created by EIHR staff from around the world. The project examines the complexity of peace, particularly as it's defined by the absence of war, as Michael was discussing earlier. We also, as I'd mentioned earlier, do take into account and share with teachers the model for framework for positive peace. And you can see here the 8 pillars of positive peace, those, as Michael was alluding to earlier, the exercise and vegetables and so forth, the indicators of what you're doing to promote peace. And so you can see here in this this slide what those 8 pillars are. I'm not going to read them out for you, but you can see that they're essential, and I'm sure that we'll refer back to them as we move through the program. For teachers anywhere, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of quantitative information that they gather across the world based on these 8 pillars is vital to education and highly valuable in the classroom. Now, Michael, when we were talking about this earlier last week, was curious about why we included our work in the US, and I explained some of that earlier. But I think it's also important to look at the context that we're living in right now. This is a time when all of us at EIHR value the insight and experience of our partner teachers globally. Progress we believed to be well established and was a foundation to build on now faces substantial challenges. We're seeing false accusations of critical race theory being taught in K through 12 classrooms, and they've led to book bans and the silencing of discussions of racial justice or diversity. For example, the Ruby Bridges book that you see there has been on banned book lists, as has the Fry Bread book. And these are wonderful texts that ought to be a part of any classroom in the United States. But they've been banned. And in fact, in some cases, simply the fact that teachers are afraid that they're going to be called out or somehow punished for teaching anything that might apply to racial diversity or social justice, they're censoring themselves before it even becomes an issue at any kind of level of policy. We are also seeing a warped perception of what people are calling balanced teaching. It's not balanced at all. It's leading to multiple instances where elected officials or school leaders or citizens coming to school board meetings are expecting some kind of both sides argument to represent what's being taught about topics like World War II or Nazism or fascism, as if we could balance both of those as if they had equal value in the world. In the case of the book, Lois Lowry's book, Number the Stars, which is a Newbery Award-winning book, it's a wonderful book for young readers about the Holocaust in the sense that it focuses on the lives of young people and does in this case focus on positive outcomes, but written with great historical accuracy. And in the case in Texas, for example, a school leader was suggesting this, we've got to teach both sides of the Holocaust. And one of the teachers who was present said, I'm sorry, that both sides of Number the Stars, and the school leader couldn't answer that question appropriately. And that's discouraging for us. And I would say that the antidote to understanding history and building peace is not to silence the history of violence and oppression. If we hark back to the 8 pillars of positive peace, what we're seeing that's devolving here in the United States, or that we need to improve on, is the free flow of information, the acceptance of the rights of others, and frankly, a well-functioning government, if it's a local government at the school board level or a state government and what they're mandating about how things are being taught. And those need to be, those are areas where we need to improve in order to change the direction that we're headed. We need to widen the aperture of history. We need to look at a wider lens to see a fuller picture and embrace the total history and not focus in on something that perpetuates that idea of American exceptionalism. President Joe Biden, on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, said, "We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, and everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides." The need for peace education here in the United States is critical. But in the end, what I love that Liz Hume often says, many of you probably heard her say this, she talks about how anyone who works in human rights and peace building, we have to be fundamentally optimistic. And I would say that teachers are clearly a portrait of being fundamentally optimistic. They invest their whole lives and professional careers in a commitment to the belief in the future by working with young people. And the last thought I will say that we would believe in at EIHR, that Timothy Snyder articulates in his book on tyranny, is that we need to learn from our peers in other countries. We need to take the time to learn from their experiences, because no one country is going to find a solution by itself. And with that, Michael, I can turn it back to you for questions or however you wish to proceed.
Kate. And what I would recommend is at this point, anybody who has a question for Kate, if you please put it into the room chat or to the Q&A, we will make sure to address those or to start answering those at the end of the sessions. I just wanted to sort of note a couple of things. I mean, I latched on immediately to sort of developing a deep understanding in the reverse design, and to kind of sort of, you know, emphasize the fact that peace education should never be prescriptive, right? It always needs to be contextualized, especially when working in countries with significant levels of trauma and conflict, right? Especially in those occasions. And, you know, thank you also for providing that very good segue to peace education in the US, because I think this is going to be sort of, you know, very much where the conversation goes now. It wasn't included in the title, but for our two next panelists, it's going to be central. I mean, you know, when we sort of look at indicators, both negative and positive peace indicators in the United States, we've seen a significant deterioration over the last 10 years. The US doesn't necessarily fare particularly well in measures like the Global Peace Index, for example, is actually in the bottom quarter. And although it has much higher levels of positive peace, that has also been deteriorating for the last 10 years, and even more so over the last 5. That's kind of sort of you know, accelerated. So on the negative peace side, we've seen an increase in violent demonstrations, violent crime, political instability. And on sort of the positive peace side, or the lack of positive peace side, you know, more difficulties in opening up a business, the quality of information, Kate, that you referred to as well, increasing group grievances, or exclusion, increases in corruption, etc., etc. So there is a lot to be done. And what I loved most is, of course, what you said about, listen, if peace education can be given, or if peace can be taught on a laptop in the middle of the DRC, then it can be taught anywhere, and it should be taught everywhere. There is no country in which peace education isn't necessary, at least from my perspective. So, Patricia, I'd love to be able to hand it over to you at this point, because from my experience of working with you as a colleague and as a friend, you've developed a wonderful formula to be able to impart peace education in the United States specifically, although you do it internationally. In fact, I think you're joining us from Lebanon today, if I'm not mistaken. But you do absolutely wonderful work that I'd love the gang to learn more about. You're Senior Fellow for Peace Education at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Rotary Peace Fellow, Rotary Positive Peace Activator as well, Chief Catalyst and Executive of the international nonprofit Mothering Across Continents, which is sort of the umbrella, I suppose you could say, of the work that New Gen Peace Builders does. Patricia, please take it away.
Yeah, well, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Kate. I always find it a great opportunity to be on a panel and be able to listen before I get to speak. And so I heard at least 3 things that, 30 minutes into our program, I think we can all take a breath and absorb. So one is, the title of the panel is Equipping Educators to Inspire Youth-Led Local Peace Building. Now, that's a mouthful. What I love about that phrase, or that title for the panel, is it encompasses everything. The idea that we have to equip educators, that they can be the source of inspiration, that they can inspire youth to actually lead peace building, particularly at the community level, as well as the global level. So we heard that. I really appreciated, Michael, the way you began by reminding us all what the definition of positive peace is, and that it is different than negative peace. Negative peace being the absence of violence or fear of violence, positive peace being creating conditions of well-being for all. And I thought Kate did a great job of reminding us that the 8 pillars of positive peace are factors that do create conditions of well-being for all. Good relations with neighbors, accepting the rights of others, well-functioning government, free flow of information, and so on. And so I appreciated that presentation. And what I really also appreciated is that Kate said that teachers really, she didn't use the phrase force multiplier, but that is the notion, that teachers are a force multiplier in terms of equipping young people and engaging them to actually be peace builders. Now, I'm going to add a 4th phrase that if anybody wants to jot it down, I think that would be great. And it is, it's all different and it's all the same. So what do I mean by that? It's all different and it's all the same. So Kate is in the United States, and she just took us on a tour around the world with the amazing work that she's doing in places like DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Bosnia. I am going to talk to you about doing work in the United States primarily for this evening's discussion, but I am in Beirut, Lebanon right now. And I'm here because we're wrapping up a year's learning journey with 100 university students and their mentors, so that they can be equipped to not only build peace projects, but in fact, this weekend, we will train a new crop of young university students or alumni of our New Gen Peace Builders program to go out and spread the word, to be force multipliers. Now, here's, I do want to get, sort of chapeau, a hat to, I'm going to set a big ambition here. I'm going to say that my ambition and our ambition together should be to have learning to be a peace builder a rite of passage for everyone. Now, that's a big ambition because there are 3 billion people on the planet under the age of 30. There are 1.8 billion between the ages of 15 and 24. In the United States, that's about 12% of the population that's between the ages of 15 and 24, but they're a power to be reckoned with. They have technology, they have access to education, they have ambitions, they're being asked by their schools to lead service learning projects. Contrast that with Ethiopia, where students there don't have the same resources available to them, but 80% of the population is under 30. So if we say we want every young person on the planet to have learning to be a peace builder be a rite of passage, that takes a lot of collaboration. It takes collaboration of like-minded people. And so Michael mentioned I had New Gen Peace Builders. I'm going to tell you this evening about a program that's related to that called Youth in Peace and Action. I'll show you how the two are actually putting peace education to work. But I want to tip my hat to the Alliance for Peacebuilding, who's been a big supporter of the work, the Institute for Economics and Peace, who's a great partner, but also Rotary International and Rotary Zones 33, 34 in particular in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeastern United States and Caribbean. And I'm going to show you how Michael called it our formula for how we can actually expand and scale peace education. So a little bit of a big-winded introduction there, but let's get going. So the big idea, I said, was that we can equip every person on the planet to actually become a peace builder. And that idea was just a pipe dream in 2013, when one person that I know very well said, why is it there is not peace education, a way to deliver it, a formula, a structure, a discipline that could be available to young people around the world? And at first I thought, well, there must be. Or no, what a crazy question. Nobody could ever take that on. There are too many kinds of school systems, too many rules, too many standards, too many government policies, too many differences in culture. It's impossible. And I was challenged to start, and Kate used the language, with a pilot. And as Kate said, sometimes a pilot takes on a life of its own. So we started with a pilot. And what you can see on this map is where the idea of New Gen Peace Builders, which is equipping young people to understand the key drivers of conflict and peace, to imagine projects for change, to be coached and mentored to put them into action, can actually take place. So you can see that in the past 8 years since that question was raised, these are places in the United States and around the world where we have equipped young people, and I'm going to stress teachers this evening, to actually understand those fundamentals. What I think is very gratifying about this work is that we are very much in the business of taking peace education, let's call it out of the hallowed halls, and putting it in the hands of community members in a fully democratized fashion. So that was the big idea. This is the spread of the program. As I mentioned, I'm in Beirut tonight. I could be in Birmingham next week for all that matters, because what we've learned from using these principles and frameworks around the world is it's all different. Context is different, culture is different, and it's all the same in terms of the tools that you can actually use to educate teachers and students. And so a little bit more about that. We use a variety of tools in a very structured program that really takes young people through the experience of understanding their perceptions, which may or may not be true about conflict and peace, helping them recognize the value of using facts and data and understand what's really going on in their community, using tools to figure out what a viable peace project might be, and then putting it to work. And you can see the photo on the top right is taken in the United States in Charlotte, North Carolina. The photo on the bottom is in Juba, South Sudan. Same approaches, same conversations. Of course, things vary by language, things vary by the types of issues that students want to work on, but the principles are the same. I want to suggest to anybody watching that there are a variety of tools that really translate very well around the world, but 4 that we like to think of our go-tos are Galtung's triangle, which is a way for students to understand that there are different types of violence, and some are visible, some are invisible, they're direct, they're structural, they're cultural. That's one, and it works everywhere we go. Another is the classic conflict tree, helping students see that sometimes they think the conflict is what they see, but there are deeper issues underneath. And there's a way of interactively providing that understanding and having students work with a conflict tree. Another is the 8 Pillars of Peace, which Kate mentioned. And that has been eye-opening for students down to the middle school level. And I'll give you examples tonight for students to understand that, well, violence actually can be the absence of a well-functioning government, or violence can be driven by lack of free information flow. I won't mention where I was flying, but when I was flying over here, I flew over a country where, boop, no internet because automatic censorship, because we were flying over a zone where you could not get internet access. That's free flow of information. So both well-being, but also violence, helping students understand these 8 pillars tends to be eye-opening, and it elevates their thinking around what they can do as peace builders. And last but not least, a 4th go-to that we often use is the Unleash model from the United Nations. It's a process of helping students understand, how do you identify a problem? How do you come up with a project idea? How do you test it in your community as a prototype? And how do you actually measure your results? So we're using some pretty sophisticated tools with young people of all ages. Really important to do, because just 3 years ago, in 2018, International Alert actually polled people in 100,000 people in 15 countries and asked them, what are the 4 things that governments can actually do? Or what are the things that governments can do to support peace education? There are 4 things that showed up top of the list in the survey. You can see that one of them is teach peace in schools. So obviously, you know, if a photo is worth 1,000 words, a short video is worth 10,000 words. I'd like to ask 2 questions. Obviously, I don't know who's tuning in with us this evening, but the first question is, if you're not in the United States right now, to what extent would you say peace is being taught in schools where you are, in schools near you? That's question number 1. So is it being taught near you? All right. And then the second question I'd like to ask is, if you're in the United States, and because this is the focus of my presentation, if you're in the United States, is peace being taught in schools near you? To what extent is peace education available and being taught in schools near you? Okay. All right. So whatever your response was, I'm very interested, you know, in your community, what's actually the truth. But I can tell you in the macro, it's generally not being taught near you. Now, how can I say that? Because I have the opportunity, you saw those spots around the globe, of seeing where peace is being taught or not taught. And, you know, Kate gave us some great clues to why it is or isn't. Sometimes it's because people are afraid of the word. Sometimes it's because people have a misinterpretation of what peace education is. But often it's because it's just hard to bring these tools and principles into established education frameworks. We have many things to teach and policies and standards to teach, no matter where you are in the world. And so the question is, how do you do it? How do you make it easy to bring these tools and principles into educational settings in a way that makes sense for educators, in a way that makes sense for teachers, in a way that makes sense for parents and community members, and a way that excites young people? So I want to show you how we're doing it. So how we're doing it is ambitiously. So I mentioned that, some years ago, somebody said, how about? And we started with a pilot of 18 students and 3 high schools. And what we saw was, as Kate suggested, there's a real hunger, there's a real energy for and demand for these tools being available to young people. And so we started to see some organic progression. We started to expand to various states with this framework and discipline and formula and tools that I've been talking about. And then there was this moment in time where we saw, uh-oh, here we go. There really is so much untapped hunger for this. And we started to see, we had 5,000 participants in the beginning of 2020, and we were able to see and project into the future, and I'm going to show you how we did it, 100,000 students being educated with these principles between 2021 and 23. Now, I want to note that's just scratching the surface, because in the US alone, there are 130,000 students. No, there are 130,000 schools, 53 million students, and 15 million of them are high school students. So 100,000 is very impressive, yes, and a long way to go to get to that goal of a rite of passage for everyone. So how do you get there? Here's what we've done and what we're doing. This year, we realized, and this was pre-COVID-19, that one of the things you have to do to scale any sort of initiative is make it available through technology. Make it available to students, make it available to professors, or teachers. So this year we said, all right, let's do a 4-part program in the Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, and the Caribbean. And we've done it with those partners, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, the support of the the Institute for Economics and Peace, and the support of Rotary International at the community level, where they have helped us support and engage schools across the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Caribbean. We have 300 schools involved, and we're about to sign on another 300. And here's what they signed up for. They signed up for a launch on International Peace Day to understand what peace education could look like in schools. And we're calling this initiative Youth and Peace in Action. We launched an online peace platform where students and teachers can get access to content, which is curriculum, case studies, challenges, and community conversations. Pretty soon, in 4 weeks from now, students who have completed a program called My Peace Builder Foundations will start getting accelerator training in how to do peace projects. We'll run 5 weekends with hundreds of students in each of these weekends. And then it will culminate at the end of the year with a big celebration of all the learning and results. All the peace projects go into sort of a platform or catalog so that more and more schools can have access to them in the future. So it's the marriage of content with technology and wide availability. Last, just a couple of points. I've been talking about students. I've been talking about the intersection of content and technology. But what I have really learned along the way is that point that Kate made early on. If you really, really, really want to teach peace in schools, you have to engage with and support educators. So that is kind of a second track that we've been working on simultaneously. This photo was actually taken in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you're going to hear from the social and emotional learning specialist with Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools in a moment. And here's what I learned from this experience. We took 12 teachers on a journey of them matching their standards, their subjects, what they have to teach, with the tools and techniques and principles that we have to offer in peace education, and gave them the support and the freedom to create curriculum units that marry the two, what they have to teach and the principles that we had to offer. And what popped out on the other end? Peace education seen through the eyes of a 5th grade teacher who is teaching her students about power dynamics in the classroom. Through the eyes of a teacher who teaches advanced placement history in a primarily African-American high school, and she's teaching them about the intersection of the 8 pillars of peace, the legislative process, the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and how you use the legislative process to create conditions of well-being for all through bills that you create and take to your representatives. I could go on and on. The list is really beautiful. There's a some links that we're going to be providing you of lots of the materials this evening. But I really want to relinquish this wonderful opportunity and space that I've had and say back to Michael.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Patricia. And there's so many kind of sort of things to highlight from that, and perhaps kind of sort of start at the end. I mean, what came out clearly on that last slide in particular was obviously the variety of applications of peace education, and the specific, I called it a formula, you may call it something else, but that package, I suppose you could say, of resources, and how that can be used in a variety of different contexts at a variety of educational levels as well, which I think is really important to emphasize. The second thing that I would kind of sort of note, and harking back to something Kate mentioned before, also about trauma-informed healing, or peace education for that matter, but also something you mentioned about kind of sort of perceptions, and facts, especially when facts are so disputed, perspectives are so different, opinions are so different, and fundamentally we are each completely different, right? And peace education does involve putting oneself in somebody else's shoes in that respect. And this is why I thought it was absolutely critical to be able to have the opportunity to bring in Carrie. Carrie, you've got significant over 20 years of public school system education in North Carolina, one of the 20 largest school districts in the United States. You're trained as a school psychologist and dedicated to social emotional learning. I'd love to be able to kind of sort of get your thoughts on how peace education feeds into this, both at the macro level, but also in terms of how students can use, or these tools that Patricia presented today can be used through a social emotional learning lens. Carrie, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here and to listen and to all the work that's happening, and make those connections with what's happening in a large school district like CMS. So thank you so much for having me. And so what I'm here to really share today is how I view peace education fitting within a social emotional learning framework within a large district. And so I've had a lot of, as Michael mentioned, background and experiences: school psychologist, academic behavior coach, intervention specialist, yoga therapist, yoga teacher, mindfulness expert, so many different things. But they all really, what I've noticed is, for me, come together and form these threads of similarities and connections that really support this work. And the past 3 years, I was actually part of a National Institute for Justice research grant within CMS that we offered for our high schools. And the purpose of that was to work on eliminating the achievement gaps that we're seeing in our national data, but also which is reflected in our district as well. And the focus was to create some systems and practices that were in place, including culturally responsive instruction, positive behavior, and restorative practices, which came from restorative justice, to close that achievement gap for African American males specifically. So I'm going to share a little bit more about that later. So I wanted to mention that. But the threads that I see through all of my work help me to make these connections here. And so really what I'm seeing is that when we look at social emotional wellness and empowerment for positive change, it begins with what are we doing to support our own inner work and reflective work. And that requires a deepening of our awareness. And when we do that, we start to understand who we truly are. And when we're provided those opportunities for self-awareness, for understanding ourselves, we are creating those connections of our inner world with the outer world. So it's, even though it seems like a very kind of like personal thing, it is, and it is so much connected to what we do and how we support the world around us, how we interact with the world around us. So it leads to these conditions arising for peace and for positive change. And so what I want to share with you now is where I view SEL and peace education and where they intersect or where they integrate. And so that begins with an understanding that one of the primary goals for education is to really teach those life skills that our students need to become responsible and influential citizens and be successful in whatever they're doing after school. So they're in school so that they can be successful with the rest of their lives too, right? So what is SEL in all of this? What CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, their definition is really very similar to what we heard about what is peace education. And that is that SEL is acquiring and effectively applying knowledge, attitudes, and skills that are necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And so what I'm showing you here is that within the orange, yellow, and green, those are the 5 core competencies that CASEL says are really, really the crucial foundation for social emotional learning. And I'd like to share on the right side how I see them overlapping with, and or really what I'm seeing with SEL is how it's laying the foundation really to support those 8 pillars that we just saw earlier, and really starting to teach those pillars and the skills within those pillars. So I could see what laying the foundation would be for social emotional learning, like learning empathy and kindness, emotion regulation, how to make and keep friends. And then where I see it kind of overlapping, starting to overlap more with peace education, and they're really similar, is that perspective taking. How do we understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, conflict resolution, violence prevention. And then the last thing is that, we don't do this in isolation. There's a generalization. We're practicing those skills out in the world with our families, with schools, with friends, and larger community. And those are represented by those blue rings that are around that circle. And so that's how I see it integrating. And now I want to get into the examples of SEL and peace education that I am seeing within our district specifically. And it's going to be a little bit experiential too, and a little bit I'll have you kind of notice what you're feeling and notice how you more reflect on how it fits with peace education based on your experiences. So the first thing that I want to share is that what it looks like in CMS is that we have a district-wide SEL curriculum. That means that all students, all grade levels K-12, receive explicit instruction for social emotional learning and building those skills, starting at kindergarten level. And that wasn't always the case, and we're still working to build that, but that's really important. And so within this SEL framework, and that we have this core curriculum that we're teaching all students, we have this opportunity to practice and integrate these lessons and skills throughout the day, just like Patricia talked about, even with our academic content. And that's what we really want. Same with peace education. We want the social emotional learning to be applied and practiced throughout the day. And that includes within academics and what's already being taught. And then there's also this flexibility of creating the space within the SEL curriculum for extensions and how do we deepen this understanding of the skills. And so some examples of this are here. And the very first one is what Patricia talked about with her seminar and with those teachers working on integrating peace education with their academic content. That is a really great example. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the next two and give you some more specific examples as well. So this first one I'm going to talk about as part of the National Institute for Justice grant that I mentioned earlier. One of many of the things, but one of the things that we created and established was this minority male leadership group in every high school that was part of our research grant. And with this group, there was approximately 20 to 25 9th and 10th grade minority males that were nominated by their teachers and other staff, such as administrators. And they were seen as having some sort of leadership potential. And our group met one time a month over the course of about 3 years, until some of them actually went on to graduate. So I actually had the great honor and privilege to co-facilitate one of these groups. So I was very much involved. And another teacher who was actually part of Patricia's program was Mr. Desmond Blackett, who is an amazing teacher and also an amazing human being. And he co-facilitated this with me for 3 years. And so the purpose of the group was to create a safe space to share student voices. And that's regarding those really vulnerable, challenging topics and challenging experiences. Share their thoughts, emotions, experiences on race, identity, what's happening at school with their relationships, society, family, other important topics. And really, it was also to promote student voice. So we would encourage our students to be leaders through their voices to inform and promote positive change on their own campuses. And in June 2021, that was actually when the research grant ended, graduates of our group actually were invited to share their own high school experiences with high school staff. So they got to also share their experiences on these crucial topics and on, how their high school experience was for them, what worked for them, what didn't, so that these educators could then take that information and make changes on their campuses to make things more equitable, code of conduct, for example, in their schools, in their schools. So for privacy reasons, I really wanted to share with you what our group looked like, but because it's not within CMS, I'm not able to do that. But what I am going to share is a very small clip here of what we actually used as a video to prompt discussion in one of our first groups. And this really shows how our group was run, the type of discussions we were having with our students, and some of their responses. They were very similar to what you're about to see. So just know this is a 7-minute video. We're only going to play about 2.5 minutes of it, but you have this resource for you. So I wanted to share that and just have you all notice how you're feeling now after watching that. For me, and I still feel it, like I feel emotional every time I watch it because it's just so powerful. And so the point of sharing that is, how can we create these safe spaces for these uncomfortable discussions to happen, for them to have an honest, open voice where they're not going to get shut down, and we can talk with them about how to make these changes for the better. So that's one example there. And the next thing I'm going to share with you is the importance, and I think Patricia hit on this also, of building capacity with our adults first. That is so important with social emotional learning, with the grant. One of the first things we did when we started the grant was to work with the adults, and we went through a training and had discussions with them on implicit bias. And all staff went through it. So it wasn't about working with the students first. It was actually working with the adults to bring a deepening of awareness and reflection, and have those uncomfortable, vulnerable discussions so that we can better understand ourselves, and our perceptions, biases, even the skill sets also, and our confidence level in supporting our students so that we can promote that change. And really, we need to be better able to model the relationships and the skills that we want to cultivate and see in our students. And so what we're really talking about here is adult social emotional learning. And so it's really important to start with the adults, the educators, the teachers, the coaches, the administrators. All of them are the ones building the relationships and supporting the work directly with the students. And so that's why it's so important for the adults to have this understanding of their own thoughts and beliefs and emotions around a lot of these topics, so that they can hold the space for these conversations to happen, for the skills to develop with their students. So I'm going to share a video from one of our high school SEL lessons. This came directly from one of the lessons. It's just the part of the video, so there's a whole lesson that goes with it. But again, as you watch this, notice how you feel and notice the thoughts that arise, no right or wrong. And then also notice, how could this support teaching and promoting peace? So yeah, that was, I watched this video and I definitely myself had emotions come up, and just, it really makes you think about, how you respond in situations like that. And so just knowing again that this is just one tiny part of a lesson for high school. This isn't even for adults, but how easily it also works for the adults. So what we're still working on is, how do we get this adult SEL out there in front of the social emotional learning, so that the adults have these conversations first, and then can hold deeper, more meaningful discussions with their students, because they already have this understanding of, how they feel, how they can hold the space for those discussions. So we can definitely relate to, what we're doing for our students, even as adults. And so I'm going to end on this quote. And this is actually also a quote that came from that same lesson from the video that I just shared. And the quote is, "Forever is composed of nows." So just thinking about what that means for you, for me, it's kind of wrapping all this up. Why provide these opportunities for SEL and peace education, especially at an early age? And that's what this speaks to me, is because now is the moment, right? Now, as a mindfulness expert, you know, every now moment is the present moment. There is no other time. We lose time just kind of wondering when. Especially in school systems, there's a lot that comes our way, and it's hard to kind of figure out what's a priority. And so if we wait, though, until high school or college or adult life to learn SEL, to learn peace, and attempt to do this on our own in isolation, there's going to be ongoing struggles. And so the earlier that we can begin to cultivate skills in students and refine our own skills as adults, I think that's going to push us to take several more steps forward to creating peace and kindness in the world and what we really want to see. So why wait, right? And so thank you all so much. I'm going to leave you with these resources, and I appreciate your time.
That was absolutely wonderful. And, starting from your last comment about the importance of, SEL and peace education being, the absolute necessity of starting it from sort of a very young age, I think is very important to emphasize. And I kind of sort of loved how you made that connection between the inner world and the outer world. I mean, at the IEP, we kind of sort of look at this quantitatively, statistical analysis, et cetera, but I mean, what you see is, you do see that distinct connection, right? You see the connection. If you look at physical systems, you see all systems are connected, right, independently of their size. And where oftentimes, when we think of peace, when we think of conflict, we think about Ukraine, right? We think about DRC, we think about Afghanistan, we think about it perhaps at a nation state level. Peace and peace education is equally important, not only obviously at a community level, but also at a personal level as well. And I think that you highlighted that really well. So we've kind of sort of taken you on a whirlwind tour of peace, peace building and peace education. We've gone from sort of negative peace to positive peace. We've gone from global to US focused. We've gone from the inner world to the outer world, and I hope that it's kind of sort of provided the opportunity to be able to think about or potentially explore potential segues in which a variety of forms of peace education can be integrated into the work that you do every day, whether you are a formal educator in history, in the sciences, in the engineering world, in the music, in the arts. You can see a connection. If you're working in psychology, you can see a connection. If you're a peace builder, you can see a connection. And if you're an interested or curious party, you can see a connection in your own personal life. So with that, I'd love to be able to open it up to questions from the audience at this point. We're all open-eared and very happy to discuss this in as much detail as you want. And we'll close at the end of this by making sure that you can leave with a good package of resources and continue to explore over time. So I'd love to open it up for questions at this point. And this is the first time that we're using the platform. So if anybody would like to, I believe we have the ability to show you on the camera, or you can otherwise come, unmute yourself. Otherwise, of course, you can add your question to the chat box. And thank you, Bob Rose, for your prior contribution regarding some of the work that the people do here. Thank you very much. Let's see, chat, read the chat. Paul Costello congratulating everyone on their amazing videos. Thank you very much. And I think that there's going to be links to those videos for those of you who would like to. A question from Paul, potentially the most difficult question of them all. And I think that it merits multiple responses. How do we measure success? I'll take a stab at this one while everybody else can reflect. From my peace perspective, you may or may not be familiar with what we do, but we try and approach peace education, peace building very much from a quantitative perspective, right? And perhaps starting with, relatively simple definitions of peace, but building them up specifically through quantitative indicators that you can track over time, whether that be in a community or whether that be across, all of the nations of the world. The Global Peace Index, for example, covers over 160 nations around the world. And you can do that, right? Once you become familiar with the attitudes and institutions and structures that create and sustain peace, right? Indicators related to the 8 pillars that we saw prior: a well-functioning government, an equitable distribution of resources, sound business environment, et cetera, et cetera. There's a variety of indicators that you can use and you can track, depending on whether your interests are at looking at it systemically at the community level, or at the family level, or at the school level, or at the nation state level, to be able to track that. Now, it's always going to be very challenging to be able to say, hey, well, my particular contribution to peace was what then caused that improvement. You know, we often avoid talking about causality, and we talk about correlation because of the many complexities that exist when it comes to peace building. But nonetheless, you do have the ability to essentially quantitatively measure changes of peace, and rest assured that the work that you're doing is moving things in the right way. That's my 2 cents. I'd love to hand it over to the group.
I would say that we measure it in a number of ways, many of them not necessarily quantifiable, but more experiential. For me, I know that when we first started doing this work, I was looking forward to a particular moment that has since taken place when we see our partner teachers in dialogue with one another. So, for example, we have our director of education, Amabla, in Rwanda, and our coordinator in Bosnia, Alma. And the 2 of them have now, on their own, well, they'll start doing presentations, answering questions, sharing experiences in ways that I know that teachers that might be participating in any program that we're doing find very valuable. So for me, that's a measure of success, when the educators that we work with start to take ownership of what we're developing and bringing it back to their classrooms and their communities.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in too, Michael, if you'd like.
Fire away, Patricia. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. I wasn't sure I could be heard. Thank you so much. One of the, I, like you, am quite quantitative in nature, but also you have to do qualitative analysis on peace education, because, as you said, there are so many variables, and it's hard to pick a moment in time and say that you've had a major social impact. But we use an adaptation of a model that's been used for years in organizational management called the Kirkpatrick model. And so that means we evaluate knowledge acquisition at the end of the learning experience, the peace education training. We also like to use a measure of peace in action. So you can be certified in the learning component of what we do, but you also can be certified and recognized if you actually design and develop and implement peace projects. I said I'm here in Beirut, Lebanon at the beginning of the presentation, and tomorrow when we do a presentation about Lebanon within PeaceCon, one of the students will actually talk about developing a peace project with a team of 11 people that looked at, despite the fact that 70% of the population in Lebanon right now is experiencing hunger and food insecurity, there's a tremendous amount of food waste. And so they designed a peace project after, the learning process, which has now been presented to a World Food Program innovation incubator. It was one of 6 projects that was presented in Lebanon as a good example of best practices in developing the Sustainable Development Goals. So we also look for other organizations of note to acknowledge the work. And the last thing I will say about that is, and I think this is really an indication that there is a hunger and a new appreciation, especially in the United States, for peace education. We find that a disproportionate number of students who become trained to be peace educators or peace builders at the high school level become very competitive at the university level. And the feedback that we're getting from universities and university awards and scholarship programs is, this is a distinguisher. This is the kind of work we need young people doing. And I love what Carrie said. It's a value system. It indicates a value system, but it also indicates a value system in action. And it indicates that we are rebirthing or re-embracing the idea of active civic engagement in a really organized way. And so I would say it's several factors. And we try to track over time. The only way you can really measure is to track over time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Patricia. Carrie, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So in the school systems, a lot of data is captured at all times. So we do have quantitative ways to measure if our students are improving with social emotional skills, which some of those ways is we have a universal screener that measures social emotional and behavioral skills and gets student voice. And several times throughout the year, every year, we have school climates, surveys. We have a lot of surveys that we do on a regular basis. Some of, I think, what we're talking about is if we see our attendance increase because there's attendance issues right now. If we see behaviors decrease, so behavior referrals or suspensions, things like that. And then if we see our grades go up, because it is directly linked to how well they do academically. And so there's that piece as well. And then I think with those school climate surveys, really the other thing that we can look at both from teachers and then also from the students' perspective is how safe they feel in their schools. And I think that speaks volumes to how well things are going. So there's a lot of different ways that you could look at it.
That's about as concrete as you could get, Carrie. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Chip, I see that you raised your hand. We'd love to hear from you. I'm not sure if we're able to hear from Chip. Chip, if you had the option of adding your question perhaps to the Q&A. Actually, let me see. Chip, I've set you as a moderator, so there's you potentially will be appearing on screen whether you like it or not. Okay, unfortunately, Chip, I don't think that we're going to be able to get you on. But if you did want to post your question, that would be absolutely fantastic. And if not, or perhaps in the meantime, while Chip comes on board, I'd love to be able to have kind of sort of a quick round robin, if that's okay. Carrie, there are a couple of sort of resources that you mentioned at the tail end of your presentation. I know that the team in the background has kind of sort of put together a whole sort of set of links and resources that we're going to make available to everybody who joined us today. But if you only had 30 seconds to encourage people or to provide them with pointers or ideas about what are sort of concrete steps that they could take to be able to integrate or otherwise leverage peace education in the United States or abroad, what would you say? Kate, let's start with you.
Well, one of our founders, Drew Bider, is very fond of the quote from H.G. Wells that says that civilization is a race between education and chaos. And in that regard, I would say that civil engagement is one of the most important things that an individual can do. And whether that's showing up when at school board meetings to balance out the voices that are coming up and yelling at board members and making threats here in the United States, or getting into libraries and assisting in making sure that books are made available for kids, and documenting peace, as was pointed out in the Seven Foundations Imagine Reflections on Peace. Take those moments to document what peace looks like so that we have examples to point to in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate. Patricia?
Yeah, I think I would join in and suggest two things. One is look at the data, look at the information about trends in the United States. And Michael mentioned some of these. When we started doing this work 8 years ago, students, when we spoke about peace, would often make references to violence outside the United States, or terrorism, or fear of outside agents. We saw their attitudes shift over time when in the US, there was a return to really being locally and community focused, which is a fine and wonderful thing to pay attention to. But I think also the data that Michael presented or made reference to And just watching the news on a regular basis indicates that there is plenty of reason to be concerned about conflict and violence where we are. So I would say, let's be honest and let's look at data. That's really important, and to recognize a trend that none of us really want to think about, but must. The second thing is, I want to reinforce Carrie's messages about social and emotional learning. Graham Simpson, who's done a lot of great research and work at the United Nations around peace education, said to me once, at the high school level, it's about deciding who I am and who I want to be in life, and what kind of difference do I want to make. And so that's most of the work where I focus. But what he said was, values is the bedrock. And so by embedding the values of peace education and relationships, as Carrie was talking about it, and self-awareness and social management as the foundation, that actually makes it possible for young people to consider these bigger questions later. So I would say, learn more about social and emotional learning programs and how they can be so broadly available, as Carrie said.
Fantastic, Patricia. Thank you very much. Carrie?
So there's something that in my yoga therapy training and what I offer people to get them in the present moment is to be with edge. Find your edge and be with your edge. And what that really means is find that place of not too much, not too little in your body or with thoughts or emotions, and to be okay being with discomfort, because the discomfort promotes the change. And so knowing what that discomfort is within you, deepening that awareness, and can then promote that change to break through with, whatever is happening. And so again, for me, it's all about doing that inner work, because that's really what my passion is. And, when you do that inner work, that doesn't mean that it's all happy all the time. Like you're doing really uncomfortable work with yourself, because you are coming face to face with beliefs and, things that you didn't even know maybe were there, and uncovering them and questioning them. Are they best for me? Are they best for those around me? Are they best for the community? And possibly changing that. And so, that work can change your life. And when it changes you, it changes everyone around you. And there's that ripple effect.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Karen. I love that. Like, find your edge. I thought it was like an acronym in the beginning. It's like EDGE, but no. It makes a whole lot of sense, and I think that it's a wonderful kind of sort of analogy that to reflect on. Thank you, all of you for your contributions today, for your reflections. Thank you to the audience and to the questions. As promised, we do have a package of resources. I'm not sure if they're going to appear on the chat or whether we're going to be sending them up as a following email. But do take the opportunity to look at them. We hope that you find them useful. We welcome any form of feedback on today's session, on the resources. What gaps do you think there are? What are your potential needs? How do you think that that peace education should be applied? We'd be more than happy to have those conversations with you individually in a variety of different forms. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for the panelists, and see you again soon. Enjoy PeaceCon.